We have to rely on literally tens of thousands of tools and apps and libraries and code snippets from random people all across the world. And if you've been paying attention at all lately, you'll know that it ain't been looking good. I don't know about you, but relying on blind luck to dodge the next North Korean cyber missile is a little nerve-wracking. Recently, we've had multiple supply chain attacks. We've had plugins and extensions sold to bad actors. We've had legitimate websites for trustworthy software compromised to serve infected downloads, plus a whole host of 0 days all across the board. And the whole thing is of course being supercharged by AI agents, which on one hand are now finding new vulnerabilities, and on the other hand are deciding what new code to write and run on our systems, which everyone is totally definitely reviewing. So let's talk about what I personally am doing to protect myself. Skip ahead if needed. Let's start simple. If you've somehow managed to avoid the JavaScript ecosystem, then congratulations. But for me, I've switched my package manager from NPM to PNPM. Originally, I did that for efficiency and monorepo improvements, but it also comes with a bunch of great security features which have caught my eye recently. Number one, the big one that most people talk about. I manually whitelist which packages are allowed to run post-install scripts. So when Axios gets hacked, it can't run arbitrary code on install. That alone is a huge reduction in the surface area of your vulnerabilities. Number two, I reject all new updates. Make sure to wait at least a full day before any new version can be installed. That'll catch a lot of the big stuff. Three, I reject any new updates that are determined by PNPM as being less trustworthy than the update that came before. Number four, I reject all sub-dependencies from risky sources, like a direct Git repo. We want to pull directly from the registry, which is more likely to have been scanned for malware. While we're on the topic of dependencies, here's a controversial one. Just use fewer of them. Controversial because just let AI write it for you. Not for complex libraries, but for everything else, why not? The code is transparent, doesn't break every 3 months when the author decides to change the API interface again, doesn't contain hundreds of random features that other people have asked for that you will never use, doesn't randomly break because the author doesn't understand semantic versioning, and isn't going to sneak malicious code into a patch update. And if your code base is more than a few years old, you almost certainly have some old dependencies that you no longer need. Maybe simply because your code has changed and you no longer use that functionality, or maybe it's because Node.js or browsers have updated and there's now a built-in standard library that you can use. Axios, for instance, is kind of redundant these days. I never thought I'd say it, but modern JavaScript is actually kind of great. Shout out to everyone but Oracle. Oh, and if you're reviewing PRs, be careful about those lock file changes. Don't just skip over those. It's a great place to sneak in a new package that you don't actually want. The biggest security improvement you can make, aside from smashing your router, is to containerize everything. If I can run an app, a plugin, a marathon, a service, a command line tool, my own project, whatever, in Docker or Kubernetes or anything else, I will. Very few things actually need to be installed globally on my machine, so why increase my attack surface any more than necessary? In particular, I'm leaning heavily on development containers, which aside from the security benefits, also unlock a ton of great DX improvements. It's great for security, it's great for switching across multiple machines, it's great for working with a team, and it's great for working with multiple different projects with conflicting dependencies. Most of my command line tools and extensions that are relevant to the project automatically get installed inside of the container. My NPM dependencies get installed to a volume attached to the container, and all my code, of course, runs isolated inside the container. Whatever you do though, do not enable the Docker out of Docker or Docker in Docker features. They sound harmless and they are easy to enable without thinking anything of it once you get to the point where you need to run some sort of containerization process inside of the container itself. DOOD, however, gives your container full root access to your host machine. Malicious code inside of the container can spin up a new root container on your host machine. It can mount your entire file system and do just about whatever it wants. D&D isn't quite as sinister, but it does come with its own added risk because it requires a privileged container. If you absolutely have to do this, prefer something like Podman or rootless Docker over just basic Docker. This will help minimize the blast radius in the event event that your container is compromised. However, I recommend just avoiding any nested containerization in the first place. It sounds way more secure to go full exhibit and yo dog, I put a container inside your container to contain your container, but in actuality, it's much more vulnerable. Prefer just a single layer of containers, flatten them into siblings if you have to. Just whatever you do not do it via DOD. That being said, even if you're not using those risky features, it's still worth looking into something like Podman or Rootless Docker. They are meaningfully more secure. Oh, and when working with container images, whether development or not, consider pinning to an image hash instead of a name or version tag. These can easily be overridden by an attacker to push an entirely separate image if the project is ever compromised. One other important consideration is that while Microsoft's default dev container images do use a separate non-root user, those users have passwordless sudo enabled. So it's root for all but the dumbest malware. Normally that's not actually a scary thing because your container's root is not your host machine's root, but you can open yourself up to some vulnerabilities simply by assuming that the code running inside the container is more limited than it actually is. So just keep that in mind when you're configuring your container. Of course, you can lock it down further or just create your own custom image, but we won't get into that. Just be aware that this could potentially be a problem. Now, this might be too much for most people, but in addition to the containers, I'm also running a Linux virtual machine. I moved as much of my development work as possible off of my MacBook and onto a Linux VM running on my Windows desktop. I did this primarily for my own DX that may not apply to you, but it is a much harder barrier to punch through than just a container or WSL, and it gives me an additional layer of protection. Defense in depth. My Linux VM is my primary development environment, my MacBook is my secondary, much more limited development environment, and my Windows host is my general computing environment. Each one has as limited tooling and credential access as possible given the role that they play. Overall, though, I'd recommend looking into any possible options available to you to separate your different work and personal environments. If your job issues you separate hardware, then great, but if that's the case, then most of what we have and will talk about has long since been forced upon you, and this is all old news anyways. I do, however, recommend Linux if you're going to make containers the basis of everything you do, simply because containers are native on Linux. Mac or Windows are technically using a hidden Linux virtual machine anyways, and if that's the case, then you might as well just get the full benefits of Linux, and potentially a VM as well. If you haven't noticed already, we obviously want to avoid being infected in the first place, but we also want to always assume we've already been compromised, and so what can we do at each step to limit the blast radius? On the topic of credentials, we want to follow 4 main rules whenever possible. Encrypt them, precisely inject them when and where they are needed, limit their access to only what they need, for as long as they need it, and require a manual action to use them. A good example is your SSH key and its integration with, say, GitHub. By default, VS Code's dev containers will forward your host machine's SSH agent into your container. This means that the code inside of your container cannot see or steal your private key. However, it can use it. The container could tell the host, hey, I need you to sign this data with your key. And so then the host will give the container not the key, but the arbitrary data signed with it. That means that malicious code running inside the container could, for instance, push a commit that automatically triggers a deployment to production. Preferably, you would require confirmation before your key is actually used. If you get an unexpected prompt, someone is probably doing something nasty, or you're just burnt out and did something really dumb and this is your sign to touch grass. Most of you are probably on Mac. There's a great app called Secretive that does exactly this. Plus, it gets your plaintext private key off your disk, so even if your host machine is compromised, your keys might not be. The Linux equivalent would be setting a passphrase on your key, plus then using AskPass, or a physical YubiKey. You could also do this with OnePass or KeyPass XC or whatever. Whatever you gotta do, just get your keys out of plaintext and require confirmation before they are used. We also have environment variables and API keys and Terraform state and OAuth tokens and who knows what else to worry about. You know not to commit these things to Git, but there's a good chance they're still sitting somewhere on your machine in plain text. That's no good if any of our earlier preventions fail and your machine is compromised. Cryptography is the closest thing we have to trust in this wicked world, so use it whenever you possibly can because it's more reliable than literally anything else. Tools like SOPs, plain old GPG, .mvex, whatever you gotta use. Encrypt anything sensitive you can. How will vary greatly depending on your circumstances, whether you're solo or part of a team, what and where you're deploying, and so on. For me, one thing I did was switch from Terraform to the drop-in replacement OpenTofu. God-awful awful name, but great project. And it recently added encryption for your state files so that you no longer need to rely on some paid cloud service or your own ad hoc solution. For everything else, I'm using SOPs to first encrypt credentials at rest, and then secondly to inject them directly into the process that needs them. I forgot to mention that I pair SOPs with GPG since you can forward a GPG agent from your host into the container. This unlocks the same secure workflow that you get with SSH, encrypted keys on the host while requiring manual confirmation to use them. Another solution I'm currently exploring is credential brokering or credential proxy. That means not giving your container the credentials at all, similar to the SSH agent. Your container might make a request to an API using placeholder credentials, and then your host or another container or remote service will intercept that request from your container, inject the actual credentials into the placeholders, make the actual request to the final endpoint, and then proxy the response back to your container. There's a lot of activity in this space right now thanks to the very real need for it with AI agents, so I'm mainly just watching and waiting for the dust to settle before committing to a solution. In the meantime, or additionally, you could also implement some egress filters and control exactly who your container is allowed to talk to. Anthropic and GitHub, fine. Random.ru domain, probably not. Here's another simple one. I'm uninstalling executable apps and using the web app in my browser. Like, is there legitimately any reason for me to be using the Slack desktop app? I'm just wasting resources running effectively a second browser that embeds their web app, all for minor added conveniences which on second thought are all distractions. I doubt Slack will ever be compromised and serve me malware, but the risk is not zero, while it is completely unnecessary. While in the web app, the risk is also non-zero, at least now the attacker also needs a 0-day to punch through the browser and infect me. Plus, I can run my tracker blockers and any user scripts and so on. Honestly, can we just go back to IRC? Since nearly all of our apps are just Electron wrappers these days, consider each one carefully. What are you actually gaining versus what are you giving up? What are you risking? I should also mention Snap and Flatpak on Linux, which containerize traditional installable applications. It can be a nice middle ground between the web app and a normal executable. Just be sure to check the permissions, like with Flatseal, because some things are bundled for compatibility, not for security. And in fact, they might not work at all using strict permissions. For the installable apps that you do need, disable automatic updates. Like your npm packages, give each new update at least a day. Let someone else get infected first and you'll get your warning from Fireship on your lunch break. And while we're on the topic, I've switched my web browser after 15 years from Google Chrome back to Firefox. This isn't some ideological de-googling or anti-AI move, but with Chromium, WebKit, Blink-based browsers having such massive market share, if you're an attacker hunting for vulnerabilities to exploit, that's probably where you're going to burn your Mythos tokens, not on pathetic little Firefox. Not to mention its users are more likely to be paranoid prickly porcupines like myself, whose systems are more locked down beyond Firefox anyways. And so even though Firefox is almost certainly technically less secure, who really wants to target it? This is pure vibes for me. I'm putting on my hacker hat and trying to calculate the economics. I can't confidently say I'm correct or even that I'm going to stick with Firefox because it's really pissing me off right now, but it is a change I've made. At the end of the day, AI is making me play this safer than I otherwise would. I think in 5 years our software is more secure than ever, but it's going to be a really nasty transition process where bad actors find and exploit vulnerabilities before the publishers find and fix them. Hopefully I'm wrong, but I don't want to be collateral damage simply because I was lazy and took an avoidable risk. If I missed anything, let me know in the comments. That's not a plea for engagement. Okay, it's a plea for engagement, but I'm legitimately paranoid and grateful for anyone who points out my blind spots. I'm sure I made a mistake somewhere.